welcome. I am Maria Cosme, and this is Pain to Power. And I am so glad to have you here today. I this show is brought to you in association with the I Rant Network. And as I said, I'm Maria, but I'm also a brown girl interrupting. And this journey of being brown girl interrupting has really been my healing journey. And today I am super excited for the guest we're about to share with you because this journey has really involved a lot of discovering and coming back to myself. And in that, I've had to really examine a lot about just some of the healing and the pieces that I've had going on. And really, it all came from my writing. And so, what I'd like to share with you today is a piece of writing that was the start of my healing journey called Control. Leaves no trace or scent, manipulation of words, stealing autonomy of moments, playing judge and jury, twisting an argument until rational thought is buried between accusations and red herrings, policing tone, sudden movements, and the depth of breaths taken. Paralyzed in fear of the next move, cautious to not shatter the momentary silence. He has won the war and the spoils, left standing in a pool of confusion, victim and target, riddled with holes from continuous jabs and stabs, leaving no trace, internal scars carved. A destroyed soul is a homeless body. The battle wages beyond the field in mind and soul, destruction and disintegration of self, self-confidence, self-awareness, self-advocacy. Bruises of narcissism painful to the touch. Invisible to the world, reclaim and reframe. Clear the fog, the pain is a badge of honor. Lessons carved into the soul, scratched and wounded, but not broken. Veering from the original trajectory, persevering with faults and fouls, living so loud the earth can't contain the sound, emotions and thoughts handled with care. Healing the wounds of the spirit, freedom from a prison of the mind. So that was my piece, Control, but that has been my journey. My journey began with me writing as Brown Girl Interrupting. And my journey began because I was really trying to understand myself in the pain and the control, but also in my identity as a brown woman. I am very excited to offer to you today my guest, who is Tanushree Sen. She has been taking this idea of understanding what it is to be brown, what it is to be Desi, which we'll talk about in a moment, and really examining what we need to learn and unlearn in our mental health journey as South Asians. So I am so excited to introduce to you Tanushree Sen, the host, producer, and the podcaster of the Desi Connection. Welcome, Tanushree.
Hi, Maria. Thank you so much for having me on the show. My name is Tanushree. I am the founder and podcaster at the Desi Condition, which is a mental health podcast, as Maria mentioned, a mental health podcast focused mostly on South Asian population. Although, really, I think there's kind of something there for everybody. You know, it's mental health; it's a hot topic. I am also a high school math teacher, so I'm based in New York City, and I maybe podcast on the side or maybe I podcast and teach on the side. Sometimes I can't really tell.
I love that because there's a flexibility within that, which is amazing. And yes, New York City, John Logic and Friends says New York City stand up. We got a heavy New York City cohort in here. I love it. And salute to you, Mr. Jones. I love it. Thank you for joining us. Our Ranters family is here supporting. And yes, so as a fellow educator, I hear you. Sometimes it's hard to know what we're doing more full time at times. But it's amazing to have you here. And like I said, I think that the way you've delved into this journey of mental health in a community where we don't talk about this often, and a lot of the topics that you cover really are things that don't get discussed. But before we get into a lot of that and talking about it, I always ask my guests to talk to me a little bit more about just your own understanding of turning pain into power. So what has that meant for you?
Pain to power is the journey that I want us all to go through, right? To me, it is a symbol of growth. It's breaking trauma cycles, and specifically, I think in the South Asian community, if you look at the history, there's a lot of kind of generational trauma to break through and to try to dissect. And to me, it's about using pain as a catalyst for personal growth and empowerment.
I love that. And I think you're very right, right? It is breaking trauma and cycles, and it's a way to start really countering those generational wounds and trauma that has carried down. And we're definitely going to be talking about that because that's huge. And thank you so much. Again, I see so much of my Ranchers fam coming up. Steph got jokes. Welcome. And salute. So with that, first off, your podcast is called The Desi Connection, but I think before we start having this whole conversation, Desi is a word that most South Asians know very well, but most other people have never heard before. So break down the definition of Desi for our viewers here.
Yes. So the Desi Condition is the name of the podcast. I'll start actually with the name of the podcast. The Desi Condition is a double entendre. So you think of the human condition, the Desi Condition. Desi is often, now I'll answer your question. Desi is often confused with South Asian. It's not really that, although it's very close to meaning South Asian. The translation is actually, it means native or from the country or of a certain country, and it refers specifically to India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And so when I talk about the Desi condition, it's the human condition of being Desi, but it's also about mental health. So you sometimes often talk about mental health conditions as well.
I love that. And I love the double entendre because, yes, right,
Mhm.
like it is the human condition. But what you just said is so important because I remember the first time I used Desi and someone in school, I think it was in elementary school, it was an Indian kid who was like, that just means you're from the nation. I was like, but that's how I describe myself, like
Yeah.
it is a mixed feeling for many. And I would say that I know in the South Asian community, in my community, I'm Bangladeshi and Pakistani, and I know you're from Bangladesh.
I'm Bengali. Yeah.
Bengali, yeah.
Mhm.
So that term is kind of something that is like this known understanding between
Yeah.
some of us, though, right? So I appreciate you extending that because we've got an audience here who maybe has never even heard that term before, and so I do want everybody to understand it. And then obviously there's the podcast itself, but before we get into more on why you started this podcast, give me a little bit more background just about you. So you are Bengali, and tell me, like, just your family history and a little bit about you growing up.
Yeah, so like you mentioned, I'm Bengali, and that's about as definitively as I can kind of describe my ethnic background because it kind of starts to get a little confusing from there. So you know a little bit the history of what happened out there. But while my parents were growing up, they grew up in what's now Bangladesh. At the time, it was either India or, depending on what time in history, it was either part of India or it was part of Pakistan. So what was then considered East Pakistan. And then later in 1971, it became Bangladesh, which it is today. But at that point, my parents had already left. And so around the time that my parents left, it was due to there's a lot of tensions, like kind of religious strife at the time in that region, and kind of there still is, unfortunately. And so my family's Hindu, and so the way that Pakistan was established was that it was supposed to be an Islamic nation, and so there was like some religious strife, and so it was not really safe for Hindus to be there at the time, and so they immigrated to India, and so that was a whole thing. But I'm not necessarily sure how to identify, I guess, as Indian or as Bangladeshi. I'm not sure. Both sides of my family speak Bangladeshi dialects of Bengali, and yet I've never actually been to Bangladesh because all of my family now is in India for the reasons that I just said. So I don't know. I'm confused. So I just say that I'm Bengali.
No,
And
I
so
love
that
it,
was
and I
interesting growing up because in yeah. Oh, I'll keep
oh, go
going.
ahead, I'm sorry.
So yeah, it was interesting growing up because I in Queens, so I grew up in Queens, and there's everyone from every country here in Queens. And so there were also a lot of Bengalis here in Queens, but a lot of them knew definitively that, oh, I'm from Bangladesh. I'm from this part of Bangladesh, and that's where my parents grew up. And when I go back over there, that's the town that I visit. And I'm like, well, the places I go are very different from the places my parents grew up. I've never been where my parents grew up. I don't speak the same dialects my parents speak. It's like very confusing. So for me, I'm like, yeah, I'm Bengali, but it's this weird watery kind of thing that I don't really know where to even place myself, even amongst the Bengalis. There's also a lot of Indians that I grew up with, and so I was friends, I remember, with a lot of North Indian people, so a lot of Punjabis, Gujaratis, people who speak Hindi, um, and their language is different too. Like we translate certain letters, we translate our A's into O's, we translate Y's into J's. We don't have a Z in the alphabet. We use an S. We don't even really have an S. It's more of an SH. Like
Mhm.
things like that. And so I would say words like masala, except I would say moshla. It's like I kind
Yes,
of
yep.
got teased a little bit for things like that, not in like a bad way, but there's just there was a little division because of it.
I look, I completely understand because I would say, as I said, my family's Pakistan and Bangladesh. So I've kind of had a lot of this history in the history of my family as well. And I think you bring up how history and religion and cultural differences all created so much of some of these traumas that we hold generationally in this community of South Asians and being Desi, right? But so within that, though, so I think you mentioned, so your parents, you were born here in America and lived
Yes,
in
I was
Queens all
born in
your life?
Queens. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So when did your parents come?
They got here around my dad was here in the mid 70s. He came here he came here for work actually, and then eventually went to grad school, and then eventually went on for a PhD. But he's been here since the mid 70s. He started out in Philly, and my mom came here mid 80s after they got married.
I love it. Okay, great, awesome. And so that in and of itself, again, like that resonation of like that brownness is very complicated. Being someone who grows up in this country but has parents who are immigrants, because there is still even that disconnect of messages and narratives. So this thinking about that, like as you grew up and being Bangla and just all the things that you've identified of even not knowing exactly right how you identify yourself. How has that impacted you as a kid and your own narrative about yourself existing in America?
Yeah. I think for any South Asian kid of immigrants, it's always a little bit confusing growing up because there's just so much dichotomy between American culture and Asian culture that my experience was probably not too different from anyone else. The part, like I said, that was different is knowing exactly how to identify myself. Not knowing which country to say that I'm from is a little confusing. Um, the part I think also that was unique to me that I didn't mention before actually was the religion thing, because among the Bengalis that I knew, a lot of them that I went to school with were Muslim, and then I'm Hindu. And so it's like, "Oh, you're Bengali, but you're Hindu. How can that be?" And so there were a lot of questions about that. So I feel like constantly I'm like giving people a history lesson, like since I was just so young. I'm like constantly giving people history lessons about Bengal, even people from Bengal. And so that affected me a little bit in that I felt like I wasn't sure exactly where to belong or how to kind of box myself. And so, but at some point, I kind of just started to accept that. I just kind of was like, you know what? I'm Desi. It's fine. I'm Desi. I'm Bengali. I'm American. And I know what I am, so I'm okay with it. It's okay if other people don't necessarily know how to put me, like what boxes to put me in.
Right. Well, that's awesome, and I mean, and that's a great thing to have that assurance, because I think there are a lot of people who struggle with that. I know I did. So that's
Yeah,
a
for
beautiful
sure.
thing to have that understanding, which is part of why my brownness is my most confusion piece of brown girl interrupting, right? I know so little about it,
Yeah.
but I love that, you've chosen to elevate the stories of people who are Desi and the experiences of that. You've come to this podcast through some of your own personal challenges. Can you tell me a little bit about just what you yourself started to understand that needed to be healed in order to even begin this podcast?
Yeah. So the other part of growing up that I also didn't mention was that I had all these thoughts about what am I exactly. This is going to relate to what you're saying, to what you asked me. Um, I did have questions about my identity, but at the same time, I also didn't care too much because to me, it was like being a Bengali, Desi, American, whatever you wanna call it, person, it wasn't like something that I accomplished. I almost saw ethnicity as like a happenstance. It just kinda happened to me, so why would I
Mm,
necessarily be proud of it? I wasn't a self-hating Indian by any means, not at all. But I also I just wasn't that gung ho about it. I was kind of like, "Okay, this is cool, whatever, it's fine." And I'm just me either way. I didn't think that I would be much different if I was, I don't know, Chinese? And
mhm,
and so it wasn't until I really started having a lot of issues with mental health. It happened when I was 28. I had, trigger warning, I had a suicidal episode, and, it was just a very, very dark time for me. I was taken to the emergency room. I was admitted. I was in the psych ward for like almost a week. And it was like very much a turning point for me. I had been aware before that I had depression, that I had issues with anxiety. I had already been diagnosed with ADD before, but nothing really kind of shook me until that moment. And so after I was relieved from the hospital, discharged from the hospital, um, I went home and I just kind of like, well, the first couple months were just me staring at a wall for quite some time. And then I finally kind of started to think about how did I let myself get to this point? And the more I thought about it, the more I thought that it had so much to do with my upbringing and so much to do with stigma around talking about mental health. And I think that when you want to talk about destigmatizing, you have to talk about culture. And that's when I started to realize that, oh, being a Bengali person, being a Desi person is actually so much bigger than I realized. And
mhm.
so that's when I started podcasting. And that's why actually I chose to make it centered around South Asian voices.
Wow. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for being vulnerable and offering your story, which it sounds like you've been through quite a journey of your own, obviously, pain, right? And realizations. I- as you experience that and coming to this itself, were there things that came from people's responses to your experience that influenced some of those narratives coming up for you and kind of rising to the surface?
So are you asking in terms of people responding to content that I put out, or specifically to my story?
No, I was thinking more your story and just in, knowing that mental health is something we don't talk about. What was your family's and community's response in this moment where you clearly were dealing with some serious mental health concerns that were not addressed?
Yeah. So the podcast came out like a year after this. So the larger community, nobody really knew. My mom knew, my sister knew that this had happened to me. They came to see me quite often. They checked up on me, and they understood what it was, and they weren't necessarily afraid to talk about it with me. When I started the podcast, I think it's like a relic of being told that you're not supposed to talk about anything that happens within the kind of nuclear family outside of the nuclear family.
Mhm.
And so I didn't talk about my story, even though I was podcasting about mental health. I didn't talk about it for quite a few episodes. Even now, I kind of don't talk about myself until it's relevant to whatever the topic is. But at this point, I have talked about that part of my story several times on my podcasts, now on yours, and like a few others. Um, but overall, the response has always been very supportive. It's been very, "Hey, I needed to hear that, and thank you for sharing." Um, yeah, always very supportive, and the community is very receptive to, stories about this because it just exists so much more than we think it does, you know?
Mm. But that's a powerful thing and a beautiful thing, because I think had this happened 10 years ago, the response could be different, right? Like I think that it's a sign of some evolvement from the community, from people, from narratives, and people being willing to talk about those things. Can I ask, so like when you started to share your story, what was it that gave you, or what made you feel like you had that, or you wanted to even start bringing yourself into the center of that story?
Well, I realized that I made the show so that other people could talk about their stories and so we could scenario map other situations. So, for example, what is it like to be a person with bipolar and talk about that with your Indian parents? And that's just an example. That's not me. But that's somebody that's been on my show. What's it like going through having an eating disorder and all these things that so many people can relate to. And I guess it felt a little hypocritical to not talk about my story, but it was also talking about it became therapeutic at some point. It was like a little release for me that, hey, this is why I'm here. Um, and it felt good knowing that people were listening and responding to it.
That's awesome. And I think again, like that vulnerability, and I see a lot of people in the chat chatting about that as well. That vulnerability is the power that you probably created to give other people permission, right? You've started the podcast, but that's like another layer, I would imagine, to bring that to light. And I want to honor, I know I saw some folks in our chat. I think I saw Tasha from No Holdbacks join us. Welcome, Tasha. And she said, thank you for being vulnerable and sharing your story. And I do believe I saw some comments from Steph Got Jokes, because it sounds like, again, for many people, knowing and understanding South Asian communities and the layers that we have in culture, oftentimes people know the surface, but we don't know the deep, right? And I think everything you're bringing up with mental health has to do with the deep culture of narratives that stop us from having some of these conversations. So let me ask you, like,
Yeah.
what are some of, you talk a lot about tropes in your podcast, right? You elevate the different
Mhm.
tropes of generational tropes. Sometimes I know that recently one of your podcasts talked about just the tropes in terms of um, sibling order, right? Child, like the order of birth, and being the oldest daughter or being the son, and dynamics, right? What are some of the particular themes that you see that keeps coming up in your shows, that are some of the deeper issues within the community that we really haven't examined enough?
Yeah. Uh, the thing you say about culture is so true, by the way, that everything that people know about South Asian culture is very surface level. We know all about the food, we know all about the clothes, we know all about Bollywood. And it's like, I really just want to talk about these deeper things. So some of the things that come up that I keep seeing, one of them is people who are in their 20 or 30 somethings and feel like their career has been a disappointment to their parents. So constantly it's, oh my gosh, my parents came here to this country, and how do I live up to their dream for me? I didn't become the doctor, lawyer, engineer that they wanted me to be. And, kind of took an alternate career path. Even people who chose to be artists instead, that's an alternate career. So that's something that comes up. Like you mentioned, being the eldest sibling, that comes up a lot. That's not something that I can relate to too much. I'm a younger sibling, but that is definitely something I hear a lot. One thing I definitely relate to is being a Desi woman. So that's very different from being a Desi man. So that comes up a lot. Luckily, I don't have any brothers, so I didn't have to see that happening in my own household, but definitely have heard a lot about that. So, yeah, double standards is something that comes up a lot.
Mm. And I think, like, we say it as the South Asian mental health and narratives, but those are narratives that I have heard as I've talked to people across different ethnicities and backgrounds, beyond the Desi community, that those are universal, almost immigrant experiences across the board.
Yeah,
That a
true.
lot of immigrant children of immigrants, or immigrants themselves coming to this country, have had to hold and kind of to navigate, right? But also, one of the things that I really appreciate, and I heard this on your most recent podcast that you had in November, you talked about a lot of history, and you started to speak a little bit about that in earlier today. But if you can go a little bit deeper into that connection between the historical things that have happened through colonization, through partition, and give us a little bit of a quick overview, because again, like I said, I think a lot of people don't know, and I rarely talk about it on this show, so you get to be our expert. And I'll probably learn something too.
Yeah.
And also, though, I think, like, how that impacts the generational trauma that is held on to by a lot of South Asians and impacting the South Asian community.
It's so funny because when I was in school, history was my worst subject. I'm a math teacher. Math was my best subject. Physics was my best subject. The subjects that nobody actually likes, right? Um, and for someone who was such a math and physics nerd, I spent a lot of time talking about history. And so I got this. You came to the right person. So I'll try to.
I know I did. I've heard your podcast. I'm like, she's brilliant. She's got it.
Yeah, okay, so I'll try to make it brief-ish and bring it back into mental health. So obviously we know India was colonized by the British. And so that stopped in 1947. India won its independence and became Pakistan and India. So there's India in the middle, there's Pakistan off to the west, and then on the other side of India is what's now Bangladesh, what was at the time of partition, 1947, became East Pakistan. And so what happened was there was a separation between Hindus and Muslims. And so they said all the Hindus stay in India and all the Muslims go to West Pakistan and East Pakistan. And I'm saying Hindu and Muslim, those were the biggest populations, but there were also a lot of divisions between other religions. There's Buddhists, there's Christians, there's Sikhs. Those are the other kind of bigger religions. But those are the two big ones, and those were the two big separations that I can speak to, at least very quickly. So that happened, and then there was a lot of religious strife that came with that, and that had already existed anyway a little bit. So then if we fast forward to 1971, there was Pakistan tried to get West Pakistan tried to get East Pakistan to change their language, because this is the part of Bengal that later became Bangladesh, but they were Muslims who were speaking Bengali. The issue that Pakistan had with that is that Bengali has roots in the Hindu holy language, Sanskrit. But that's just the language that they were speaking at that point. It doesn't really mean they're converting to Hinduism. Like that's not what's happening. That's just the language of the region. But they wanted them to speak Urdu instead, which was the national language of Pakistan. So then Bengalis literally had to fight for the right to speak their own language. And so they went to war with Pakistan, and they gained independence in 1971. And ever since then, Bangladesh became Bangladesh. And all those things that I talked about had a lot of effects because there was so much movement between countries. There was so much movement between countries, and so that means that families kind of got torn apart. There was genocide and famine in all of those things that I talked about. Like, that's 2 wars that I just talked about in the span of about 70-ish years. No, 30-ish years. It's been about 70 since then.
Yeah.
So there's famine, there's war. The Bengali famine was one of the biggest famines in history. That was, right around the 1940s. Actually, it was around the same time as the Holocaust. So, to give you an idea of the figures, 6 million people died during the Holocaust, 3 million people died during the Bengali famine. And so that literally has an effect on our bodies today. A lot of people, especially in the Bengali community, have issues with like fat in their abdomen, like losing that fat in their abdomen. That's because our body stores fat over there because we literally went through famine. Like, that's something that we have kind of like, our bodies have changed for that reason. So, like, these little things, our bodies really do store trauma. And so the way that we grow up, it's the 1940s. We're talking about my grandparents' generation, even my parents when they were younger, like that generation. And so it passes down to us, the way that they live with a scarcity mindset. My dad had an insane life. My dad had an insane life. Like, when he was 16, he evacuated Bangladesh, had to move to India, but kind of just shunted around between different parts of India, was separated from his siblings during his formative years. And this is stuff he didn't tell me until I was like 31 years old. I'm like,
Mm.
you had this insane life and you never told me any of this until I was 31. But it's
But that's
because
part
like
of the
he doesn't
Desi
talk about this stuff.
condition
A lot of our
too,
parents
right?
don't talk about this stuff. That is just
Okay.
such a quintessential part of the Desi condition, is that there's so much trauma that they don't wanna talk about it. But the way he
Mhm.
acts, like, he obviously acted in, like, a very anxious manner. He had some anxieties to him. He had, like, this scarcity mindset to him, and I never really understood it until he started talking about these things. And now I'm like, "Okay, like, it's coming together now." So I hope that that kinda makes sense, the history and the mental health, how those
Oh,
things tied together.
absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for breaking it down. And I'm going to say that my family, so I'm a little bit older than you. I think my generation's like my father was the 40s. But I would say that, it impacts everybody so differently, right? So I know this is a little spoiler alert, but on April 28th, you'll hear my story because I was on your podcast where I talked about the Desi condition from my
Mhm.
perspective of my family. Um, but so let me ask you, you said your dad's told you in your 30s. What made him finally start to have a conversation like that? That is rare, right? So there has to have been something
Yeah.
that got there. What was it?
My sister and I sat down with him one day. This was not that long ago. I mean, this was just a couple of years ago. I'm 33 this year. And, she just kind of started asking him about his origin story in America, and he had an insane story for that too. He's like, "Oh, yeah, I came here with $8 in my pocket, all casual, as if that's not a big deal." I'm like He's like, "I came here with $8 and then I landed in Philly and then I just had to, like, find a job." I'm like, "That's it? All willy-nilly, not a big deal?" But, I mean, clearly he figured it out. Um, so we started talking about that, and it wasn't too emotionally deep. He just, like, kinda didn't mention that part, but it wasn't, like, this traumatizing thing that I was bringing up necessarily. I mean, that in itself is a hard thing, by the way, coming to a country, being an immigrant. and having
Huge.
$8 in your pocket is already
Yeah.
kind of like traumatizing, but it wasn't like the worst. Like, for him, that's not that traumatizing for everything else that he was about to tell me, right? So it's like it was almost like taking baby steps. And then she just became more interested in his background. She's like, okay, well, from then, what happened before that? Where were you before you got to America? Where were you before that? Where were you before that? And then it became almost like we were we were drilling him. And I guess he just decided we were old enough to know, and he just started telling us everything.
I love that, and I think that's amazing. I kind of wish I could talk to my dad. My dad passed away about 13 years ago, and now, like, as things are coming up with me understanding my brownness better, that's something that I wish I could have had more conversations with him about, because he was in the throes of all of that as a child who was had to move from India to Pakistan and all the things, right? And but
Yeah.
I I think what you speak on, though, again, is sometimes it is the next generation that allows for the older generations to be able to speak on things that they otherwise have been conditioned not to. As we're talking about history, though, I am
Yeah.
curious, because this does come up in your podcast a little bit, but I'm curious to know, for you, we speak on partition without really speaking on who did a lot of the partition. So colonization and the impact of British imperialism certainly had a hand in that. Do you think, or have you seen that some of those messages of whiteness, of that those ideas from colonizers has also impacted some of those messages that are carried through the generations of South Asians?
Yeah. Yeah. So I talked about scarcity mindset before without getting too much into what it was. So that's one of the things that comes up, I think. So scarcity mindset means that you're just willing to accept less, willing to accept less pay, willing to accept lower positions because you're out here just trying to scrape by just to make it through, because this is what the colonizers did to you. Like, they just made it they normalized having to scrape and just try to survive that way. So that's one of the things. I also noticed that some South Asian people might not be happy that I'm saying this, but there is like a crave to be close to whiteness among some of our people. It's really gross. So colorism is a big thing among the Indians. I know that that's also a thing with the Black community, and with certain other communities. Like, colorism is a big thing, and there's also division. Maybe this is because there's so much diversity within India. There's like 50 something languages. There's all these different religions. Um, Casteism, like, that's a thing. So these things already existed that the British came and exacerbated and kind of pitted us against each other. So one of
Mm.
those things I think that are most relatable probably in today in America is the model minority myth, this divide and conquer thing that they did. Like, it worked. It was exactly what they wanted.
Absolutely.
We fell
Yeah.
for that trap. So the way that we constantly criticize even other Indians, I've heard so many people travel all around the world and they go to India and they're like, damn, nobody hates Indians like Indians hate Indians.
Mm.
So, like, it's messed up and it's sad and it's true.
Mm. Thank you. And see, I could see it. All the chat is blowing up because there's so much that you are
Yeah.
relaying about stories and history and culture and racism in all the layers that we don't always talk about. So welcome, Raz. Logic and Friends says that's deep. I know I saw some as Talk Sister for sure, right? Troy Hines, welcome, Troy Hines. He says, amazing story. More people need to learn about the trauma of Desi people. Brown, Black people around the world can truly relate to these experiences. Again, yes,
Yep.
very much universal, very much the impact of imperialism, colonism, and the truly that dominant culture narrative of what is valued and what is devalued, and how it becomes internalized in our everyday notions of how we're functioning in society. And it's deep, and I would agree. I think some of the most racist people that I know, unfortunately, are South Asian. And
Yep.
internally to each other, that internalized belief of colorism, but also externally, right? And it's something that, again, for me is really important to start to examine about the brownness and about that condition of us holding on to beliefs that really are antithesis to our deep cultural values that come from our religious background, from our history of culture, from the fact that we were once one big giant country that all connected and had families. And so, yeah, I mean, I again am a product and part of those generations of that partition and the impact of families separating and families, my family's from East and West Pakistan. My mother and my father, were literally on other sides of the war. And not my mother and my father specifically, but their families. So yes, to all of that. Um, but let's come back to the podcast and just thinking about, you mentioned how for you it was therapy. Tell me a little bit about how this podcast has really helped you in your healing journey.
This podcast has totally changed my life. So I started podcasting. I had the idea in 2019, early 2019. I put out episodes on my own in October of that year. I kind of ideated through those months. And it was also around that time that I started realizing that I wanted to be a teacher. I think it was through podcasting that I realized that. Because what I was doing at the time felt so much and still does feel so much like educating. Not because I'm necessarily educating directly, because I'm not a mental health professional, and so I try not to, like, get too much into doing any kind of direct education about here is what anxiety looks like and here's what you should do about it, because it's, like, really not my place to do that. But in terms of understanding what happens within our culture and how to, kind of overcome that, and in terms of scenario mapping other people's stories and what they did for treatment or what they did for, whatever it is that they needed to do. It felt a lot like education because what I was doing was interviewing, and um, what I try to do is just ask good questions. And I think that a good teacher will ask their students the right questions to kind of help them reach their own conclusion. And so I felt like I was talking not just to my interviewer, but I was talking to my audience to get them thinking as well. And somehow the jump made sense in my head that I felt like that was a teaching moment. And so that made me go through this whole career change from mechanical engineering and industrial designing to teaching math.
I love that. So that definitely helped with the healing. Were there anything else, any tools that you've kind of picked up along the way through the conversations you've had that have helped you also?
Yeah, I mean, mental health and activism have a lot of overlap. And I've kind of always been interested in that space. I'm always following and engaging with voices that are not Desi, are not um, female necessarily. So a lot of trans voices on my feed, a lot of Black voices, a lot of Hispanic, like every kind of voice that you could think of are on my feed because I'm just interested in it. And I think like getting into the mental health world has opened me up to that even more. And so just thinking through how to decolonize your mind, um, thinking about the evils of the world, things like white supremacy and capitalism and
Mhm.
patriarchy and, like we said,
There's so much.
colonialism. And it has really opened me up to those things. Yeah, it has opened me up to understanding those structures and understanding the ways that I was upholding those structures, and honestly continue to, because it's very hard to disengage from things like
Mm,
capitalism, right? Um, but it has taught me how little that I know, and so I'm constantly learning now.
mhm, mhm. I love that. I mean, is there a particular narrative that you think, like, I know for me, like a lot of my unlearning has been sometimes this narrative of not being able to um, focus on yourself. Like there's this taboo around putting, thinking about yourself or self care and all those things. I mean, are there narratives for you that you have learned to finally reclaim and reframe?
Like for me personally, yeah, I think that learning self-care was also big for me. Yeah, learning that self-care looks like a lot more than just taking myself out for a nice dinner necessarily, although that stuff is important too. It's not necessarily face masks and shopping. It's doing the hard work too, right? That's self-care. Doing the hard self-reflection,
Mhm.
doing the journaling and like crying through it and open mouth crying and like screaming about stuff is self-care. It's part of healing. And it's ugly,
Yeah.
but it's important.
It is definitely. I mean, but did you struggle with putting yourself first at any point? Like I know that's a narrative that oftentimes we as women, particularly in the South Asian
Yeah.
community, are told to take care of everyone else, right? And many women, I'm going
Yeah.
to say across universally in many different cultures and communities, right? But there's something particularly I know that I have struggled with in that generational message, right? Shove your own feelings, your own things, your own stuff. That doesn't matter. Focus on the nurturing, focus on everyone else. Is that something that with self care you ever struggled with?
I do struggle with it. I still struggle with it. I think, well, I'm a teacher and the day gets so busy. So I struggle with it literally every day. I have to like bargain with myself to take 5 minutes to go to the bathroom or like to take 10 minutes to inhale my lunch, you know? It's or just take 2 minutes to go refill my water bottle. Yeah, I definitely still struggle with it. Um, y- you know, it's some days are just better than others and some days it's I don't win the war against myself,
Yeah,
but,
that's
we're
life.
working,
That's
we're
life, right?
trying.
I think it's the constant
Yeah.
evolution and relearning and unlearning, right, of things. So
Yeah.
in all this work, you've obviously, I mean, you have a community of people that are South Asian, that are friends and family, right? Have you started to shift their understanding of things through doing this podcast, through kind of learning and sharing with them? Like, do you see the people around you evolving through your learning a little bit?
A little bit. It's funny because I feel so uncomfortable with my friends listening to my podcast that I'm like, "Please don't do that in front of me." But, no, I definitely think so. Whether or not it's through me talking, it's also at least through the stuff that I share on my page. Um, Yeah, I definitely think that I also think that the community in general has become more open to understanding mental health and talking about mental health. Yeah.
What do you think is the catalyst to that more openness?
I think that some of it is pages like the one like what we do is just literally people putting our voices out there is inspiring other people to put their voices out there. And so people are just realizing that they're not so alone. I also think that other communities got to it before we did. And so finally we kind of just I mean, we have friends in other communities and so we just decide, you know what? Like maybe it's time to follow suit. Maybe me too. Why not?
For certain, and I would agree. And I, I mean, in discovering your podcast, it's like this whole new world has opened up for me. That I hope all of you are going to go and follow Tanushree and follow the Desi Condition on Instagram and TikTok, Facebook. Are you on other social
I'm
media
on
platforms as
Instagram,
well?
I'm on Facebook. I've tried to get into TikTok. I don't know what it is about
That's all
me and
right. No
TikTok,
judgment.
but we're like oil and
That's
water.
plenty. That's plenty. You're trying to squeeze in water breaks and bathroom breaks. So like it's okay if you can get TikTok in there too, right? And
Yeah.
but go and follow her, follow the Desi Condition, because I think truthfully, I know that, and I appreciate all my Ranchers fam and all the people who have showed up in the chat and hopefully who are watching the rebroadcast. Make sure you hit the bell and hit the like and share a comment about what's hitting you here. But truthfully, go and follow, because Tanushree really lifts up so many elements of universal mental health issues, but from the perspective and lens of being South Asian that many of us do not fully understand nor even address. And that's coming from a South Asian. So if you're non-South Asian, you definitely can gain a lot of insight into the experiences of others through this. And I always am all about this show itself. For me, is about counter narratives and counter storytelling, because the power of truly creating community and solidarity across communities is through seeing the humanity and those universal shared experiences that we have, as well as those very different, unique, identifiable experiences. So Tanushree shares a lot of this. And before we head out today, I want to give you an opportunity to just think about, like, I mean, is there anything else that, or maybe what's your goal? What's your goal of, like, what do you hope people walk away with when they listen to the episodes and they hear your podcast, which they should, friends and family and all. Please, I'm going to ask you to break that narrative and encourage everyone to be listening to you, because they should be. And my friends and family, I want you to listen to me and I want you to watch. So I'm outside that boat, but so for you, you know, what do you want people to take away?
Mhm. So I think even though it is centered around South Asian voices, I really think that there's something there for everyone. And somebody in the comments said before that there's so much that we can learn from the brown and black communities. And I think there's a lot of overlap that the South Asians have with other Asians, with with a lot of other. Think about literally any culture, any country that has been colonized, and like, there's a kinship there that we can understand. What I hope for people to get from their own from any episode of mine is that they are not going through any experience by themselves. There's always someone else that can relate to what they're going through, and there's always something that they can learn from someone else. Um, and that there's just, if I could talk to my younger self, I would say you don't have to feel like this. It doesn't have to be like this. And I hope that that's what people get from my show as well.
I love that. And giving permission to heal, to speak on things that are unspoken, that is tremendous and brave work. You're making a big impact. I think you have quite a large following. How many people listen to the Desi Condition?
You know what? We recently moved to iHeartRadio, so I think that number has changed a lot, and I don't know what the number is. I can't really tell you. I don't have the stats in that until after the season is over, which will be around June. But if you are looking to listen to me live, I am on Sundays at um, 7 p.m. EST on the Ruckus Avenue radio channel on iHeartRadio. So I'll get back to you about my stats.
Well, I'd love to know, but on Ruckus Avenue radio channel, and you can also find on Spotify. I know I've seen some things on Spotify, and so how will they listen? Because I know April 28th.
It was
I'm
on
super excited
Spotify.
and so grateful.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
It was on Spotify. It will go back on Spotify after the season is over. I'm not releasing on Spotify right now. My release is happening through Ruckus Avenue. So if you go to my Instagram page, I have the link in the bio where you can find all the episodes that have come out this season. And if you want to see past seasons, all of that stuff is on Spotify, also on my link tree in my Instagram.
I love it. That's awesome. And please stay tuned. I am super excited because I got to be on the other side of this channel, on this stage,
Yeah, it was
where
awesome.
I was interviewed by Tanushree, who's an amazing interviewer, and
Oh my gosh,
shared
thank
my
you.
story of really what divorce has been like as a South Asian and this taboo topic that we often don't talk about. And so definitely tune in April 28th at 7 p.m. on Ruckus Radio. And we'll have all the links and everything shared with you. And definitely stay tuned.
All
Make
over the
sure that you are
place.
following me, that you are following Tanushree, that you are following the Desi Condition podcast. And of course, a shout out to my producer, Logic, Mr. M, the man who is amazing, always making it all happen. And shout out to all of our supporters in the chat. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for experiencing, for sharing your thoughts. Please make sure, if you haven't done it yet, if you're watching the rebroadcast or you're watching us live right now, click that bell for all the notifications. I come on every Sunday at 9 p.m. with new guests talking about the journey of pain to power and how we heal. And I love it. Film de Montiel says he's going to take a spin and check out the Desi Condition. Welcome, V Smiles TV.
Yay!
I love it. My iRant family is there. Thank you, Raz. She'll be there too. I love it. I love it. And so as we close out, I opened up with talking about coming back to ourselves. And I love it because you've shared this, how this podcast has brought you back to yourself as well. I want to close out with another poem that I wrote, which really is this next step after the control, after the pain, when we come back to ourselves. This one's called Wild Horses. The constructs of love and relationships are illusions of grandeur. Containment and achievement has us hooked. Blindly believing we are meant to be tied to others, there is comfort in connection, home found in safety and trust. I believed in it once. Love would anchor me, holding me safely, giving grounding. I would exist without flailing. Existing isn't thriving. It's if tethered to the ground, you cannot fly. Soaring beyond in the adventures of life isn't birthed in traditions. Relationships can be shackles that bound into stagnation. People are fleeting. Nothing stays the same. Growth is inevitable. Countering the narrative I've been fed, I will not venture a planned path curating expectations of women and motherhood. I am a wild horse roaming freely, running towards my wants and from the limits. My spirit is too intense and expansive to be measured and choked, interrupting the status quo, jumping before looking, reaching the depths unseen. My heart finds peace in uncertainty and possibility, leaping into the unknown, eyes wide open, hands poised to receive. The universe will hold and cradle my soul. Love is within and shared through. I am not meant to be the story you created, not destined to be caged in restrictions of labels and roles. The world will watch as I roam, leap, discover, and create magic, carrying home within my words and movements, lifting and connecting my soul's tribes. No longer adhering to titles and society's plan, wild horses are not to be tamed or housed. Constructs are meant to be dismantled. So please go and read my writing. I have been writing as my healing and my healing process. Please make sure that you tune in to Pain to Power. You tune in to the episode of the Desi Condition on April 28th and every Sunday at 7 p.m. And follow me, follow Tanushree, and make sure that you are continuing to grow, to heal, to come back to yourself in your healing journey by discovering and rediscovering who you are meant to be, and the possibilities beyond. Thank you for joining us. Peace, love, and thank you, Tanushree. Light.
Thank you so much.
My world has slowly crumbled around me countless times, and every time I rebuild with the pieces I've been given to birth something so transformational and beautiful that no one else knew might exist before it was shown to them. These moments tend to coincide within my romantic path. The universe has been telling me to focus on the revolution and not romance. It has over time given me the tools, resilience, and light to turn my pain into power. And only now do I see that the key to this always resided in the love and knowing I had in myself, not from the external sources of family or men. The message I have been avoiding might be that my time in this world I had existed in was not to receive love, but to put it out there for others to see, feel, and heal through. Revolution before romance moves pain into power.